On November 2nd, 2012, an 83-year-old woman raised her right hand in a federal bankruptcy courtroom in Los Angeles and was sworn in to prove she had written a television program watched by 20 million people. Her name was Arvella Schuller. For 40 years, she had produced The Hour of Power. The judge's ruling was one word long, essentially, nothing. She owned none of it. And here's the part nobody mentions. She wasn't some minister's quiet wife in the gallery. She was a corporate director. The court defined her famous husband as an insider because he was married to her. Let me say this plainly at the start, because the title deserves an honest answer. There is no record of Arvella Schuller ever being offered a divorce, threatened with one, or discussing one. There is no mistress in this story, no secret second family, no hotel registers, no hush money. Robert H. Schuller's ministry was, by the standards of American televangelism in the 1980s, remarkably free of that kind of scandal. So if you came for a sex scandal, you can leave now. What you'd be leaving is stranger. Because the thing that was taken from Arvella Schuller was not a husband's fidelity. It was authorship, 4 decades of it. And the reason that question, why did she stay, actually has teeth, is that she was not powerless, not ignorant, and not broke. She sat on the board. She ran the program. She knew exactly what her name was worth on paper, which was nothing. And she signed up for another year, and another, and another, for something like 57 of them. Start with what the public bought. The story America knew came in a single postcard image. 1955. A young Iowa preacher with $500 to his name, standing on the tar paper roof of a snack bar at the Orange Drive-In Theater in Southern California, preaching to people sitting in their cars. Come as you are in the family car. 25 years later, that same man dedicated a building made of roughly 10,000 panes of glass designed by Philip Johnson and stood inside it in a purple robe and aviator glasses while an orchestra played. In every version of that story, there is a woman at an organ. That's her role. Wife. Organist. Nice touch. Now look at what was actually filed in federal court. There is a document in the Crystal Cathedral bankruptcy trial marked Exhibit P38. It's called the Transition Agreement, and it's dated December 28, 2005. Except the copy that first got filed with the proof of claim was unsigned, with the date left blank. A blank space where the date should be. That's in the court's own written decision. The agreement promised the Schullers compensation, health insurance, staff, travel staff, and an office suite on the 12th floor. And it promised those things, in the agreement's own language, for as long as either Dr. Robert H. Schuller or Mrs. Robert H. Schuller shall live. Mrs. Robert H. Schuller, the woman who had produced the program for 35 years, appears in her own lifetime contract without a first name. Hold on to that, because it comes back. So who was she before she became a blank line? Arvella Dahan was born in 1929 into a Dutch Calvinist farming community in Orange City, Iowa. Even her birthday has a problem in the record. Published obituaries give July 25th and July 29th. Small thing, but it tells you something about how carefully the world was keeping track of her. She was a musician, not a woman who dabbled at a keyboard, a trained organist playing in church, good enough that the instrument was her identity before anything else was. And here the record splits again. The New York Times account says she was an organ student at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and met Robert Schuller there, where he was also studying. The account from Michael Nason, who later co-wrote a biography of Schuller and worked closely with the family, is different. Schuller was a seminary student invited to guest preach, walked into a sanctuary, saw a young woman at the organ, and afterward told a friend he'd just met the girl he was going to marry. 2 meeting stories, both printed as fact in obituaries, days apart. Nobody ever reconciled them. Put them side by side and notice what they have in common. In both versions, he sees her at the instrument. In both versions, the first thing about her that mattered to him was that she could do something he couldn't. Robert Schuller could not read music. They married on June 15, 1950, the same year he took his divinity degree. His first posting was Ivanhoe Reformed Church, a small congregation outside Chicago. 5 years there. In that time, she began having children. 5 of them, eventually. Sheila, Robert, Jean, Carol, Gretchen. Their son was born in Blue Island, Illinois, in 1954. So by the time the famous part of the story starts, she was 25 years old with a young family, and the household ran on a small church salary. Then the denomination sent them west. Here is what the drive-in origin story leaves out. When they arrived in Garden Grove in 1955, there was no church, no building, no congregation, no organ. There was a rented drive-in movie theater and $500. He stood on the snack bar roof with a microphone. She sat below with a portable organ, playing to a parking lot, with small children nearby. Everybody tells that is charming. Look at it from her side of the asphalt. A trained church organist is now performing outdoors, into car speakers, for an audience that mostly can't see her. That is not a career. That's a job you take because your husband's career requires it. And she was good at it, good enough that when the congregation grew and moved into an actual sanctuary in 1961, and then into the Tower of Hope in 1968, the music program that grew around her became one of the ministry's genuine assets. She recruited the professionals. Don Fontana, later Frederick Swann, one of the significant American organists of his generation, and orchestra director Johnny Carl. She built a music department that could fill a cathedral, and somewhere in there, she stopped being the one who played. Nobody announced it. There's no farewell concert, no retirement, no interview, where she explains that she was setting the instrument down. The organist simply hires better organists, and then hires a choir, and then starts scheduling everybody, and one day the job is administrative. She also developed a private school attached to the church. Notice the pattern. Everything she touched became an institution, and every institution had somebody else's name on the door. On February 8, 1970, the Hour of Power went on the air. This is where the marriage's real operating system gets installed, and it's worth being precise about it, because the public never saw a second of this. Arvella Schuller was the executive producer and program director of the Hour of Power. Not honorary, not helped out. She held that job, by her own sworn trial declaration, for 35 years. What did she actually do? The Orange County Register, reporting after her death, put it about as bluntly as a newspaper can. Her fingerprints were on every element of the production, booking the guests, editing the content, fine-tuning her husband's sermons, building the music, fine-tuning her husband's sermons. Read that again. The single most famous Protestant preacher on American television, the man whose entire product was his own voice, was being edited by his wife before broadcast. Ed Arnold, a Southern California broadcaster who volunteered as the program's announcer starting in 1970, said it without hedging. She was the brains behind the church. Ann Moore Waltz, who met Arvella in 1956 and sang in the Hour of Power choir, said she was the power behind the Hour of Power, and added that she gave her credit for all of it. Arvella had her own line about the arrangement, one she liked to use with people close to the family. At home, she'd say, her husband ruled the roost, but she ruled the rooster. It's a joke. Farm girl humor from a woman raised around actual chickens. Everyone laughed. File it away. It gets less funny. Here's a scene, and it's the single best window into how this marriage actually worked. From Michael Nason, who was there. Schuller preached one Sunday, and it didn't land. Flat. He came back to his office, and his wife told him so, told him the message had fallen short. And Robert Schuller, the apostle of possibility thinking, banged his fist on the desk and told her she shouldn't be telling him how to deliver his message. Then, the next day, he went up and did precisely what she had told him to do. That's not a woman being tolerated. That's a woman with editorial control over the product, and a husband who knew it and hated knowing it. The fist on the desk is the ego. The next morning is the business. So now hold two facts against each other, because this is where the story stops being sweet. The ministry's own audited financial statements from the late 1980s, introduced into evidence at the bankruptcy trial as exhibits, show Arvella Schuller being paid $50,000 a year as executive producer of a program that at its peak reached an estimated 20 million viewers in something like 180 countries. Meanwhile, in the year the court used for its calculations, her husband's housing allowance alone came to $118,992, plus $20,000 in insurance, plus $198,000 in what his side of the case called license fees, plus, under that transition agreement, a discretionary fund of $300,000 a year to spend on ministry initiatives as he alone determined. She got 50. He got a discretionary fund 6 times that size, on top of everything else. She was on the board that approved these things. Now watch what the machine cost the family, because this part her husband published himself. In July 1978, their daughter Carol was 13 years old and riding on the back of a motorcycle in Iowa when it crashed. She nearly bled to death. Her leg was amputated below the knee, and then again through the knee. She spent months in hospital. Where were her parents? Korea. That's not speculation. Robert Schuller wrote it in Tough Times Never Last, but Tough People Do. The sentence is that his daughter lost her leg while Mrs. Schuller and he were in Korea. He describes the long flight back, trying to work out what his first words to her should be. Publicly, that trip was the global reach of an American ministry. Privately, it meant a 13-year-old was in intensive care on one side of the world, while both her parents were on the other. The family later turned it into one of the most told stories in the Schuller catalog. Carol's courage, her return to sports, her skiing. There's an entire book about it, written by her father, titled The Courage of Carol. He wrote the book about her recovery. She wrote her own later. And in 1982, Arvella published a book of her own, The Positive Family, in which she discussed things the broadcast never touched, including her own breast cancer and the loss of her left breast. That fact, incidentally, gets a strange, cold corroboration 30 years later in the bankruptcy record, where the court lists the employee benefits the ministry provided her: health insurance and cancer insurance. That's how her illness enters the official file, as a line item in her compensation package. Now, to the document that turns this whole story around, and the beautiful, terrible thing is that Robert Schuller wrote it himself, and he wrote it to Congress. October 1st, 1987. The House Ways and Means Oversight Subcommittee, chaired by Representative J.J. Pickle of Texas, was investigating television ministries. This is the Backer era, the year the whole industry was under a microscope for exactly this kind of thing. Schuller wrote to Pickle to demonstrate the integrity of his operation. His letter, entered as a trial exhibit 25 years later, states that, in the interest of the highest level of integrity, he and his wife and his son received no royalties or any other extra compensation of any nature from any of their books, tapes, or other materials distributed through the ministries. In 1987, that sentence was a shield. It was proof they weren't looting the till. Remember it. It comes back as a weapon, and it gets pointed at her. Meanwhile, look at what she was building in those same years. Under her direction, the Hour of Power became, according to family and colleagues, honored for it during the Carter administration, the first syndicated television program to carry closed captioning. Think about what that means. Arvella Schuller's professional achievement, the innovation that got her recognized in Washington, was making sure deaf people could receive her husband's voice. She spent her working life making him audible. Her own name never once appeared on screen the way his did. By the early 90s, the arrangement was fully mature, and everyone inside it knew the terms. Which brings us to the question that had never been asked out loud until a federal judge asked it. Who actually owned the Hour of Power? The answer arrived from a witness the family called themselves. Charles Todd had been general counsel of the ministry from 1984 to 1995. He testified, under oath, at the 2012 trial that there had been an understanding. The copyrights to the Hour of Power would be registered in the ministry's name, but Robert and Arvella Schuller would own them. And the reason for registering it that way, according to his testimony, was to avoid bad publicity if the Schullers openly claimed ownership. That is an extraordinary claim, and I want to be careful here because the court did not accept it. Judge Robert Kwan found the preponderance of evidence went the other way. There was no writing, nothing signed, nothing produced at trial. And starting in 1991, under Todd's own supervision, the ministry began filing registration forms with the U.S. Copyright Office for each episode, listing itself as author and the program as work made for hire. So, disputed claim, unproven, possibly a former lawyer's honest memory of a handshake that no longer existed in any drawer. But here's the part that isn't disputed, because Arvella said it herself on the stand. She testified she wasn't even involved in the decision about whose name went on the registration. Sit with that. The executive producer of the program was not consulted about who legally owned the program. She didn't find this out in 2012. She found it out in 1991, or near enough. She was a director of the corporation. She was in the building. She was producing the thing being registered. She knew her name was nowhere on it. And she went back to work. For 16 more years. So, why? Let's take the obvious answers seriously, one at a time, and watch them fail. Religion. Reformed Church in America, Dutch Calvinist, Farm country Iowa, a preacher's wife. Divorce would have been unthinkable, surely. Except here's the thing. It wasn't. Their own son, Robert A. Schuller, divorced his first wife in 1983, remarried in 1984, was ordained in the Reformed Church in America, and appeared on his father's broadcast almost every week from 1976 onward. The family survived a divorce. The ministry survived a divorce. It was not the wall people assume. Money. She'd be destitute. Except she was on the board that set the compensation. She and her husband owned property outright, including a beach condominium in Laguna, and she had her own book contracts and her own salary. Not rich by her husband's standards. Not helpless either. The children, real and heavy, 5 kids, all of whom eventually worked for the ministry. But the youngest was grown by the mid-80s, and Arvella stayed 30 more years. Children explain a decade. They don't explain a life. Social expectation. Sure, she was America's most watched preacher's wife. But she'd already proven she'd break form. She was a woman running a national television production in 1970, which was not what preachers' wives did. Love. Probably. There is no evidence of contempt between them, none, and quite a lot of evidence of partnership. But love doesn't require you to hand over your copyrights. So what's left? The one thing nobody thinks to check. The program was hers. That's the bargain, and once you see it, the whole marriage clicks into a shape. He got the pulpit, the name, the books, the honorary doctorates, the presidents, the purple robe. She got the thing itself, the content, the music, the schedule, the guest list, the final cut, a seat on the board of directors of the corporation that owned all of it. To leave him, she would have had to leave the hour of power. There was no version of a divorce in which she walks out with the program under her arm. She'd just been shown, in black and white on a copyright registration form, that it wasn't hers to take. Staying married was the only way to keep her hands on the only work with her authorship in it. That's not weakness. That's a woman reading the ledger correctly. And there's a detail buried in the court record that shows how completely this couple had fused themselves into the institution, to their own ruin. Robert testified that he typically wrote his sermons at the Laguna Beach condominium, the one he and Arvella had donated to the ministry, which is precisely why the judge ruled his sermons were written on the employer's premises. Work for hire. Their gift became the evidence that destroyed their claim. They gave away the house they wrote the sermons in, and the giving away is what proved they didn't own the sermons. Now watch the whole structure come down, and watch what she does. January 2006. Their son Robert A. is installed as senior pastor. It's the handover the transition agreement was written for, the one dated December 28, 2005, the one with the blank date on the filed copy. In 2008, it falls apart. His father forms an office of the president, removes him from the hour of power, and by November the son has resigned. Public reason, a lack of shared vision. Actual result, a family at war in front of a congregation. October 18, 2010. Crystal Cathedral Ministries files. Chapter 11. Debts north of $43 million. The choir goes. The orchestra goes. 140 people lose their jobs. The pageants that had run for decades get canceled. Then the bankruptcy does what bankruptcies do. It opens the books. A U.S. trustee starts objecting to insider compensation. Reporters at the Orange County Register start printing the numbers. 23 insiders, $1.8 million in a single year, half of it in housing allowances. The chief financial officer with a $132,000 housing allowance on a $12,000 salary. The Schuller daughter and granddaughter with overlapping jobs on the program. Everything Robert Schuller told Representative Pickle in 1987 about the highest level of integrity was now being litigated, line by line, in public. And in the summer of 2011, the board of the ministry he founded voted him off it. 84 years old, 56 years after the snack bar roof. Voted out by a board largely made of his own children and employees. His son later described the vote to reporters. His mother, Arvella, was on that board. She voted with the minority, the losing side, to keep her husband. Notice what she did there. She didn't issue a statement. She didn't cry on television. She voted. In a boardroom at 81, on a motion to remove her husband, she cast a ballot and lost. In February 2012, the campus was sold to the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange for about $57.5 million. Two of their sons-in-law and their daughter Gretchen were fired within days. In March, the Schullers resigned from the board entirely. And the statement announcing it, the one carried by the AP, by NPR, by every wire in the country, was issued in Arvella's name. She was the one who said they could not continue to serve in what had become an adversarial and negative atmosphere. The husband, who had spoken for 56 years, said nothing. She spoke for both of them. Then came the trial. November 2012. Arvella Schuller, 83 years old, took the stand in a Los Angeles bankruptcy court to establish that she owned some part of what she had made. The court's memorandum decision, issued November 26, 2012, runs to 55 pages. It is one of the coldest documents in American religious history, and it is worth understanding exactly what it says about her. It says she was an employee. It applies the Supreme Court's test for work made for hire and finds that the ministry provided her tools, her office, her premises, her staff, her schedule. It notes that she was paid $50,000 a year. It notes she received health insurance and cancer insurance. It notes she had no copyright registered in her name and never applied for one. And it cites, as evidence against her, her husband's 1987 letter to Congress. The letter in which he assured the United States government that his wife received no compensation of any nature from the materials the ministry distributed. In 1987, that sentence protected them. In 2012, it was used to prove she had never owned anything. Her claims were disallowed in their entirety, every one of them. Her husband, asking for over $5 million, was allowed $615,624.68, a fraction, but not nothing. She got nothing. And there's one more line in that record that I can't stop thinking about. Their son-in-law, Tim Milner, had been running something called the Robert H. Schuller Library, and part of that job, according to his testimony, involved the preservation of hour-of-power footage that was in danger of deterioration. The work stopped when the bankruptcy hit, because there was no money. 35 years of her life's work, physically rotting on tape in a vault, while a court explained to her that it had never been hers. 14 months later, in early February 2014, both Schullers fell ill within about a week of each other and were hospitalized. On February 11th, at UC Irvine Medical Center, Arvella Schuller died. She was 84. Her daughter Carol said it was very sudden, and that she died peacefully, surrounded by family. Robert Schuller had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer the previous year. According to the Orange County Register, he stopped his chemotherapy after his wife died. Read that again. The man everyone in America assumed was the engine of that marriage. The voice, the face, the possibility thinker, the counselor to 6 presidents, was told he had a treatable window and put down the treatment when she was gone. He lived another 14 months and died on April 2nd, 2015, in a care facility in Artesia, California. His funeral was held on April 20th, on the campus he had built and lost. It is called Christ Cathedral now. The Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange paid for the service. Both of them are buried there, in the Cathedral Memorial Gardens, the cemetery Schuller had the foresight to put into the plans back in 1991, which is now the diocese's only ecumenical burial ground, kept open to non-Catholics precisely because of how it started. She went into that ground first, in 2014. He was buried beside her in the family plot in 2015. So why did Arvella Schuller refuse to divorce Robert Schuller? She never refused anything, because nobody ever asked. That's the honest answer to the literal question. What she refused was different, and harder to see. Outsiders would say she stayed because that's what a preacher's wife did in 1958, and kept doing out of habit. That explanation is comfortable and it is wrong, and the evidence against it is her own conduct. She hired the professionals. She edited the sermons. She took the board seat. She cast the losing vote. She signed the resignation statement. She hired a lawyer and sued the ministry her husband founded. Whatever she was not passive. What the evidence suggests she actually valued was the work. The hour of power was the one thing in that entire 57-year enterprise that she had made with her own hands, and the marriage was the only door that led to it. Leaving him meant leaving the program. The bargain was never fair, but she understood it better than anyone else in the building, which is why she was still fighting for it at 83 in a courtroom, with a hip that wasn't young and a case she was going to lose. And now go back to the joke. He rules the roost, she rules the rooster. Everybody laughed at that for 50 years and heard it as a wife's charming modesty. It wasn't modesty, it was a job description. She was telling people exactly how the operation ran, in plain language, and nobody listened, including eventually a federal judge. Go back to Exhibit P38 too. The lifetime agreement filed with a blank date, promising support so long as Dr. Robert H. Schuller or Mrs. Robert H. Schuller shall live. The document that erased her first name was also the only document that assumed she would outlast him. That whatever else happened, she was the one who would still be there at the end. She wasn't. She went first, and he stopped treatment, and the ministry she built runs today under a grandson in a different building in Irvine, still called the Hour of Power. Still going out on Sunday mornings, 40-something years after she designed what it should sound like. There's one last thing. The glass building isn't the Crystal Cathedral anymore. The pulpit isn't his. The name over the door belongs to a diocese he had nothing to do with. But when the Diocese of Orange lists what stands on that campus today, the tower, the carillon, the academy, the gardens, it names the two people buried in the ground there. Not the founder and his wife, Reverend Robert and Arvella Schuller. She got her name back on the property. It only took dying to do it.